wonderful new year, 2018 is finally here, which of course can only mean one thing: it's time to take a look at some more Doctor Who Big Finish audio drama releases. And today I'm kicking off the brand new year of Big Finish audio dramas with the First Doctor Adventures Volume 1, with David Bradley returning as the First Doctor in pretty much the continuation of Twice Upon a Time, in two brand new adventures at a full cast with his original companions. Start off with, this box set was originally released on Christmas Day, literally immediately after Twice Upon a Time, so there has been a little bit of a delay with this review, with Christmas and with New Year and with the general other reviews getting in the way. There is also a few other later 2017 reviews on the way soon, just to finish off that year's worth of audio dramas. But yeah, this is now out on the Big Finish website. You can buy it on the pre-order price of £23 and the download is £20, and then when it's released nationally in other stores, I do believe that it will be going up to something like £30 or £35, and it is in fact a rather unusual format. I do believe that this is a first for this channel with Big Finish reviews, where we're essentially taking a look at the running time of two Big Finish main range releases put into one box set. So you've essentially got a 4-hour box set spread across two stories. So yeah, that is a rather interesting format, very much like the 1960s stories. However, one of which I really do like. I think it was better to go with two sort of larger stories rather than more sort of smaller ones. I think that that's definitely more fitting to the First Doctor era, rather than sort of the more new series style of 1-hour format. Start off with the episode titles of this release. The first episode is The Destination Wars, written by Matt Fitton, a Big Finish regular, and episode 2 is The Great White Hurricane, written by Guy Adams. And this whole box set is directed by Nicholas Briggs, and the script editor is John Dorney, and it is directed by David Richardson. So pretty much your normal Big Finish regulars for this release. A very nice production team, in fact actually some well-known names in there, and generally the cast for this release as well is incredibly strong. Of course, it would make sense to start off with David Bradley as the First Doctor, and naturally similar compliments to Twice Upon a Time with this. I think that he's generally a very good impersonator of William Hartnell's Doctor. I think that he is very good in this release. I think you can definitely tell that he is slurring certain words, the way that he pronounces certain words as well, and the way that generally he structures his sentences is very much like the First Doctor. Of course, the majority of that can in fact be also put down to the scripting for this release as well. Something to note is there isn't really much of this generation gap idea, much like how we had in Twice Upon a Time. We all know by now things such as go and put the kettle on, go and sort of clean this, go and dust this, all of that stuff. There's not really any of that in this release. Instead, it's just the First Doctor going and doing First Doctor-y things. I think Fitton and Guy Adams have done a really good job of actually reprising the First Doctor, much like how they would have done for the early adventures as well. This isn't necessarily the first adventure to in fact star the First Doctor. I think generally they've just got another actor to play the First Doctor for this release, and as I say, David Bradley has done a good job. There is certain moments where you think, hang on, this doesn't really sound like Hartnell, hang on, this is a little bit different. However, naturally it will be like that because it's not William Hartnell, and naturally David Bradley, good for him, isn't actually as unhealthy as William Hartnell was. Of course, the time when the show was actually being produced, he did have several health issues. I do believe that he smoked quite regularly, drank quite regularly as well, and naturally he did have memory loss as well in the later half of his series, as was experimented with in Adventure in Space and Time. So we have seen quite a lot of that throughout Doctor Who media. This release naturally is a little bit more of an upbeat Hartnell. It is very much like Twice Upon a Time, however a much more healthier version of the First Doctor. There is a little bit more of an ideal version of the First Doctor, and because of that, naturally you don't actually feel like it is William Hartnell. I think for those people that have actually seen the First Doctor adventures on TV, there is quite obviously a big difference between the actual First Doctor and David Bradley, and I think that that is kind of a good thing, because to actually have something that separates them both out. And at the end of the day, David Bradley is not the First Doctor, he is an impersonator of the First Doctor, so it is nice to have a few little alterations in there and a few changes that David Bradley has probably kind of made himself, just to make it a little bit easier for him, but at the same time on audio makes it just a little bit more recognisable as, hang on, no, this is David Bradley, obviously not William Hartnell. Few decent one-liners in there as well, and generally I think they've gone for a little bit more of a warm and fuzzy Doctor to an extent. I think that throughout both of these stories, two of which sort of go to two different settings, I think that generally he has some nice moments in the first one, and in the second one he's a little bit more laid back, maybe a little bit more serious as well at the same time. So yeah, they have definitely captured his character really well, which is mainly down to the writing team, to be honest, in this release. Next up we have Claudia Grant as Susan, of course once again reprising her role from An Adventure in Space and Time. We also have Gemma Powell as Barbara Barbara Wright and Jamie Glover as Ian Chesterton, and the reason why I'm saying all of them together is because it is a similar situation to David Bradley, where you can quite obviously tell if you've watched the classic series that they are not the original people. I think that definitely they're not as sort of spot on as David Bradley for when it comes to the different impressions. I think that especially Susan, played by Claudia Grant, I think that she isn't exactly spot on as Susan. Thick persona of Susan, a little bit more of an emphasised version of Susan that is a bit more exaggerated in parts, a little bit to an extent with Barbara as well. I think that generally Gemma Powell has kind of emphasised some of her traits being rather well spoken, and I think that Jamie Glover as well as Ian Chesterton seems a little bit more, not necessarily aggressive, but doesn't exactly sound how William Russell actually did within the actual series. So naturally you can tell that these are the people that aren't actually the real people that were originally cast as the role, but at the same time I think that all of them do a good job as the actual characters that they are portraying, just not necessarily the most accurate versions of the main character itself. So yeah, generally good companions generally for the 60s. I think they don't necessarily have an amazing big role to play, because that was generally a theme with the 1960s Doctor Who stories, but yeah, a strong cast for this one, and compliments generally overall for the companions. And the final character that I really want to touch on for this release is Jamie DeFreitas as the Master, which is rather interesting. We've never had a story with the First Doctor and the Master from what we can see, and generally he is a really good Master. I think that he's very serious, rather evil sounding. I think that generally his voice works perfectly in audio as well. I think that there are some lines, especially within the first half of the story and when he's going over the tannoy in the later half, sort of addressing all of his people, it sounds very masterly, he sounds very powerful, he sounds very cunning, very evil. I think that he sounds a little bit Roger Delgado-esque. If anything, I actually wanted him to have a little bit more uniqueness to him. I think that definitely setting him out between the other classic Masters, there isn't really too much in it. I think that he could have had something just a bit different to make his Master stand out a little bit more, but at the same time I'm kind of taking into account that this is essentially now our first ever Master story, meaning that it would essentially be the introduction to his role, so you don't exactly expect anything big at the very beginning really. You kind of just expect them to settle in his sort of character and introduce him to the series, which very much I guess this series does in fact do. Destination Wars, the first episode for this release, is a more sci-fi based story for this box set, and is generally the Doctor and his companions going to a futuristic setting in the space year of 2003, where you pretty much have this human colony that has just landed on this planet, developing their new technology and sort of really getting to grips with their planet because of the person called the Inventor that has kind of gave them all of the technology to go and do their own thing and kind of build this sort of new world for themselves. And it is sort of the early sort of fraction of humanity going out into the universe, kind of, however, still a little bit more of a dystopian future idea. There is the idea of flying cars, very much the impression that 1960s Doctor Who would have. There isn't really anything new and unique about that idea, sort of big gleaming buildings. I could imagine this story, if it was in the actual series, being very sort of simplistic and white looking. Everything would be a little bit like an Apple store or something like that, sort of floating tables, floating cars in the sky, maybe like big massive glass buildings like the Shard or something like that. I think that naturally this fits the rather stereotypical futuristic setting that 1960s Doctor Who portrayed quite a lot, maybe a little bit like a Dalek City or something like that. I think that that is a very good atmospheric piece, and generally the main idea for this one and the main selling point is of course the Master and the relationship between the Doctor and the Master in the story. And Master through this one is the main idea of hypnosis really, and the idea of him manipulating people's minds, especially Ian Chesterton's throughout this release, and actually sort of contorting the way that he thinks, developing how he thinks to actually change the events of the story. And then Barbara soon clocks onto this, and sort of we have the idea of him using Ian as a little bit of a puppet in the later half of the episode. But at the same time, the main interesting selling point is the actual reaction between Susan and the Doctor and the Master, and showing that how they knew each other before technically the series actually started, and showing a little bit of the Doctor's history, why he escaped Gallifrey. I think that this is definitely an interesting idea to go into that area of Doctor Who that we've never really gone into before, and I think that it does pose a few questions in there. Brilliant scene at the very end where the Doctor is with the Master over the telecom in the TARDIS, and the Doctor does something to save the day naturally, and we have this wonderful moment where the Master says something like, "You have to get me out of this," and the Doctor says, "I'll meet you again someday," or something like that, or cheerio. He's very cheery about it. He's very sort of very comedic. It's very much like how the First Doctor was at certain points in the actual series, where he would sort of get excited and go at everything, and sort of get incredibly jumpy, because he did have a few of those moments in there whilst being a very serious Doctor at the same time. And at the very end of this one, the whole idea of "I will meet you again someday," it very much gave the idea that the Master and the Doctor were brothers. I got that impression throughout the very early half of this story, which is quite a nice effect considering that in the Third Doctor era they were initially planning to reveal that the Doctor and the Master were in fact brothers at the very end of his series, but that was of course replaced with Planet of the Spiders. And yeah, I think that this episode is a nice opening story. It just could have done a little bit more, I think. It could have gone and developed those ideas a little bit further. I just think considering this is the very start of Doctor Who, and probably within the first 2 seasons of the series, I kind of just expected a little bit more and for it to do maybe something a little bit more adventurous and a little bit different. But at the same time, I kind of respect it because it fits into the 1960s theme of Doctor Who very well. That whole idea of a futuristic city, getting Ian and Barbara back home, Susan very much being the damsel in distress, kind of screaming absolutely everything, and then when she sees the Master, leading to a very interesting scene where she's confronting him, being rather scared, and she gets imprisoned, very much like how she would in the actual series. So this is very reminiscent of actual 1960s Doctor Who, but as I just kind of wished that it did a little bit more with that. Episode 2 of this release is The Great White Hurricane, written by Guy Adams. Now, I went into this episode, I actually went into the first one like this as well, completely blind. I didn't know what the episode was about, I didn't read the description, I didn't even listen to the trailer, because I don't think it was actually out until hours before the actual release. I didn't know anything about it, and then I found out that this episode was a pure historical, and naturally, I got incredibly excited. Of course, previously we had The Behemoth in 2017, which was a pure historical, absolutely loved that one, and I absolutely loved pure historical stories when it comes to Doctor Who, and 1960s Doctor Who once again was very much based around that idea, that educational purpose behind the show, going to this period time such as the Reign of Terror, such as the Aztecs, such as the Romans. That's the reason why I quite like 1960s Doctor Who, because it actually goes and does that historical stuff the later half of the series then goes on and fails to do, and the new series definitely goes on and fails to do, because we've not had a pure historical story in literally the 10 plus years that the new series has returned. Yes, I'm still annoyed about that. In New York, where we had the Great White Hurricane, also known as this massive blizzard that basically killed many people, and I do believe that Barbara said at some point the worst ever snowstorm that has actually hit a populated area, and I never knew about this part of history, not gonna lie, but I actually felt educated at the very end of this episode. I felt like I knew something about this part in time, I knew how it affected people, and there were some absolutely wonderful moments, because I believe that Barbara, I can't believe that I don't know this, but I think Barbara may have been a history teacher within the actual show, or she may have knew certain things relating to history, because naturally she's a very intelligent woman. That's the same with Ian Chesterton. So there is a few moments when Barbara actually sees a newspaper at the very start of the story with the date on, and she realises straight away where they are and what is about to happen, and the damage and travesty that is basically about to unfold in front of their eyes, and how they need to escape. And it is pretty much the stereotypical 1960s idea of there is going to be this massive thing that is going to happen, we need to escape before it does, and naturally they never do escape, and they end up actually being a heart of the actual disaster. And I think that with this one, Barbara has a few moments in the early half of the story where she pretty much is the walking fact bible of going around going, this happened here, this happened here, this train line here couldn't run, many people died, suspended trains, bridges fell down, the river like sort of froze over, things like that, very much sort of like a geographical textbook kind of, just listing certain historical facts. And I quite like that, because naturally it felt like a 1960s Doctor Who story where the aim was to actually educate the listener or the viewer on the actual topic in time. And I think that with this story it definitely does that. The way that Susan gets kidnapped by a gang as well, this whole episode is about the idea of gang confliction, and we have Susan with one half of the gang, and then the Doctor with another gang, and sort of they imprison certain people, and the Doctor gets in trouble with the police, leading through a few very comedic moments where he's trapped within a cell, being very literal with this other sort of prisoner in there, saying, oh, maybe you should speak up a little bit, and oh, this is going to be a very long night in here, or I can't be bothered, I've always gotten to the wrong side of the law, and things like that. It has some wonderful, really quirky one-liners, but sort of unintentionally quirky one-liners. So I do definitely think out of the 2 releases, this one is my favourite. But naturally, when you've got a sci-fi story or a pure historical with me, naturally I'm probably going to like the pure historical more, just because of the person that I am, and I do love the historical stories. And I think that definitely the way that Ian and Barbara got in touch with somebody in this story, I can't particularly remember what her name was, I'm going to try and find her now. I think she may have been called Rena, I think, or Rosalita, maybe Rosalita. She's played by Caroline Valdez, and she is basically a woman in the story that is affected rather personally by her previous husband, beat her and beat his son as well, and he was very violent towards them because of alcohol. And we have this story between him kidnapping his son of the woman and then actually going on this train, and then we have them all sort of conflicting together, where Ian and Barbara is actually with Rosalita and they need to try and get the son back, and naturally they end up sort of personally involved within the situation, or Susan already being involved with the gang stuff as well. It all sort of folds together in the very end and creates a rather nice fitting ending where Susan gets saved whilst being on a frozen river, and everybody needs to sort of pluck together, and the police come together at the very end as well. And it's a rather nice sort of, it's odd describing it as a warm and fuzzy story, considering that this is, as I say, the coldest blizzard to ever hit a populated area, but I think that generally it's just got a nice sort of feeling about it, because at the very end people survive. The person that was sort of is wanted to be killed throughout the whole episode and wanted to be tracked down ends up surviving, but he ends up handing himself in because he's killed somebody and feels like he has to admit by the very end of it. It has some very nice morals behind it, very much once again like a classic series Doctor Who story based within the 1960s. So yeah, Guy Adams has done an incredibly good job of actually getting you to care about these people and getting you to care about the setting, and for that reason I do like The Great White Hurricane more than the first story, simply because it's a pure historical, and I felt like I personally got involved in the actual story and got involved with the characters. And also, as an additional bonus mention of something that I completely forgot to say about, is an additional thing that I like that they've once again gone to the fitting thing to do, is actually name each individual story of this release. Now, it being a monthly range style story, is around 2 hours long, so it is split into 4 episodes, and each episode is actually got a certain title. So for the Destination Wars, the first episode is Journey to the Future, episode 2 is The Father of Invention, episode 3 is The Destination Wars, and episode 4 is The Prisoners of Time. And then The Great White Hurricane has got 4 episodes once again. It's called The Coming Storm. It was going to be called The Oncoming Storm, apparently. I like that reference. Well done, Guy Adams. Episode 2 is The Frozen City, episode 3 is The Killer in the Snow, and then episode 4 is The River of Doom. And I love the way that we have sort of doom, of invention, once again, of time, very 1960s, sort of very B-movie style, kind of, very much of the time, as I say once again. So yeah, I do like that. I like the care that has gone into actually making this a very reminiscent piece, much like how the 10th Doctor and Rose Adventures were very much sort of reminiscent and nostalgic of that era of Doctor Who. I think that generally the production team has got an incredibly good job of actually developing this whole era of 1960 Doctor Who, and I think that that's definitely benefited by the cast as well, being incredibly strong. As I said, David Bradley did a good job of playing his own version of the first Doctor. I want people to respect that William Hartnell was the original Doctor and David Bradley wasn't. I think that if it ever gets to a point where people see David Bradley as the Doctor more than William Hartnell, that is the moment where I'll start to get a little bit concerned. I think that at the end of everything, much like how Twice Upon a Time did, where we have the first Doctor actually turning into William Hartnell at both the beginning and the end, I think it's always a good thing to remind the actual listener or viewer that William Hartnell was the original, you might say. That was such an unintentional quote, but I'm so happy I got that in. But that's that overall for this release. I think that this is definitely aimed at more of the hardcore Big Finish listener, especially with the running time being more of a main range Doctor Who story as opposed to the more simplistic 1 hour stories. And I think that generally it may be something for the new series listener as well, if you're somebody that is interested to get into the classic series. As I say, if you're maybe put off by the black and white effect of 1960s stories, however you like audio dramas, this is probably one of the first hand ways to actually get into this series. And I must admit, it is nice to have a 1960s style Doctor Who story that is actually fully cast for once, as opposed to it being one of the early adventures, because one of the main early adventures flaws with me is that I think that the narration and description that always happens on occasion with those sort of brings me out of the story and kind of reminds me that it isn't real, kind of, and it sort of wrecks that illusion. But at the same time, it's odd, because in some stories I can get along with it fine, and then in others I think that it kind of puts you off a little bit, and it is just nice to have a 1960s story, as I say, that is fully cast. And generally the casting for this one is very good. It's very strong. I think that they all impersonate who they are meant to be impersonating rather well. So yeah, if you're somebody that is wanting to see more David Bradley as the First Doctor, then this is definitely a release for you. I do recommend it. As I say, it's around £23 and it will be good up in price a little bit later on, I do believe. Yeah, that's generally it for this release. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope that if you have any questions about this release, do leave them in the description below and we'll try to answer them as best as possible. I think for general releases in the future, because this is called Volume 1, I'm presuming that we're probably going to get a Volume 2 at some point. I'm just hoping that they push the boat out a little bit further, maybe add a few new challenges in there. I'd love to maybe see this David Bradley Doctor go up against the Daleks or something, even though we had quite a few Dalek stories with the First Doctor as it is anyway. I think it would be nice to see him actually go up against some notorious Doctor Who villains, just to maybe give him a little bit more of a settlement into the role, because I am still a little bit iffy about him, even after Adventure in Space and Time, because he was playing Heartland, that's why I was fine with it. But since Twice Upon a Time, and then since these ones as well, I just feel that he needs a little bit more pushing, and sort of, it's not entirely sold yet to me, but it is nearly there. So for that reason, I'm glad that the writing team has done a really good job on this one. I do recommend it, however, it's probably not a release for absolutely everybody in the Doctor Who community. It is a little bit of an obscure one. So thanks for watching this review, hope you've enjoyed it, and I shall see you all in the next one, whatever that may be, at some point in the near future. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all next time. Bye for now.